we're live. It is Wednesday, November 25th, 2020, 5:01 p.m. I am not in the hammock today, although I spent much of the day in the hammock.
That sounds really weird because Jen probably doesn't know about the hammock.
Well, the hammock is my new studio, yeah. And I'm not in it now because I was in it for several hours reading sections of your book. And so now it is time for me to be a little bit more vertical than I have been while reading. It is now officially, and I think it's an important day to note this, it is 5:01 p.m. and it is dark in Washington, D.C. So we are now officially in the dead of winter, even though it's quite warm out. Kate, the monologue's yours today.
Yeah, so it's the day before Thanksgiving, and I don't know what this means for most people, but for me, this is actually kind of the most wonderful day because there's no exact time pressure of especially if you're hosting Thanksgiving. There's no time pressure of okay, everything has to come out and you have to time. It's just the most boring part of cooking to me. It is just the if you're kind of good at cooking and timing meals, it's I start the stuffing so that by the time everyone eats the stuffing tomorrow, it's had an entire day to hang out and kind of cure and be really good and get extra special good and type of cooking. And so I've spent the whole day doing that. And I think it's just kind of wonderful. And then I took my mother-in-law to try clamming and oystering for the first time because she's here and because we're in Cape Cod. And it was going great. And then I got stopped by a shellfish warden and I didn't have a license. And I was my dad had a license and he was with us. And they were yeah, that's not your license. That's his license. And it was just this whole thing. And I was I realized how much of a norms follower and not rules follower I am, in which I have basically I'm yeah, you just don't take the really small oysters. And I've paid most of my life for a license every year, but I didn't this year because I was lazy and I didn't have a check, which is a stupid reason, but I could only pay by check. And yeah. And so anyways, I ended up kind of breaking all of the rules and she threw out half of my oysters and then didn't give me a fine because I was very lucky. Didn't give me a fine.
So wait,
but
I have a serious question, Kate.
Yeah.
Are you now officially an oyster poacher?
Oh, I was before this. I just didn't want to tell you. I
No. But I mean, that makes you cooler than I ever knew because you are. There's that. Yeah, because you're out there poaching, illegally poaching oysters. Yeah, you're like a criminal. It's kind of awesome.
Yeah, no. 100%. So anyways, we don't have
I think Mike Chase would have something to say about this.
Yeah, I think
in fact, I'm going to text him and see what he has to say about oyster poaching.
I'm pretty certain that all shellfish laws come under local jurisdiction, but if there's a federal shellfishing law, I would like to know about it.
You know, we're going to...
There probably is.
We're going to find out because we got to know this. All right.
We don't have fun anymore.
We don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Jen Mercieca.
Yes.
Got it. Mercieca. Who is here by popular demand. Another guest who is been demanded by the audience over time. She is the author of Demagogue for President, as well as 2 other books about presidential rhetoric. So, welcome to the show. Are you yet working on a book about Joe Biden's rhetoric?
I am not. I don't plan to write a book on Joe Biden's rhetoric. I have a new book
I don't
project.
think anybody else does
in
either.
theory. Yeah.
So-
I mean, I can say some things about it and why it's presidential and not demagoguery, but I don't
Well,
think
so
it's-
That would be good.
You know, Donald Trump is still the president. So let's honor that reality.
Thanks for reminding us, Ben.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, Susan Hennessy and I wrote a chapter in our book about the Trump presidency that was about his rhetoric and about what makes it distinctive with respect to other presidents. I'm curious for your view on that subject. Donald Trump sounds nothing like any other president ever. What is the thing that makes him sound different?
Because he's a demagogue and not a president. That's the
So
simple
define
answer.
demagogue for everyone.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I agree with you, but yeah.
That's my thing. I keep saying that over and over. Yeah, he doesn't make any sense as a president, but he makes a lot of sense as a demagogue. So the word demagogue comes from the Greek, literally translates into a leader of the people, which isn't very descriptive or helpful as a translation. And if you look it up in the OED, the first definition says that the demagogue is a heroic figure, someone who defends the interests of the people against the other parts of the state, which are viewed as corrupt. The second definition in the OED is the one we're more familiar with, and that's someone who uses polarizing propaganda for their own gain, who, you know, uses polarization as a strategy. And so that to me is more helpful. And that's what I try to do in my book, is to show how Donald Trump was both the heroic demagogue for his followers and the rhetorical strategies that he used to help them to understand him in that way, that he was defending their interests against the other parts of the state, which are corrupt, and a dangerous demagogue, or the villainous demagogue to everyone else. And the criterion for judging between the two, because of course, if you like the candidate or the president, you're going to call them a heroic demagogue. And if you don't, you're going to call them a dangerous one. The criterion for judging is accountability. So a heroic demagogue might use some of the same rhetorical strategies. They might praise their followers with an ad populum. They might use American exceptionalism. But if you ask them, you know, why they do that, if you ask them, you know, if they've made a mistake, they're willing to say, "Oh yeah, I shouldn't have done that," or, you know, "Yeah, I am accountable to the rule of law," or the rule of, you know, the people, the will of the people. Whereas a dangerous demagogue is not.
So I am very curious about. Oh wait, I have a huge echo somewhere. Is that you, Ben?
No, it's coming from Jen. It's okay. I've muted her. I'll mute her when one of us speaks.
Okay. So I was kind of really curious. I've always wondered about, like, I studied linguistics and like cognitive science at various points, and I've always been I think the rhetoric as a term is one that is kind of thrown around without precision. And I'm kind of actually very happy for the chance to ask somebody what exactly is meant by rhetoric, and what it kind of like, what falls into the purview of things that you look at to kind of do an analysis of the rhetoric of the president, for example.
Yeah, thanks for asking me that, because I love to explain this to people. So I think of rhetoric like Aristotle did. So Aristotle said that rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. Dialectic is the questioning and answering, you know, method of philosophy. And dialectic will lead you to Sophia, right? A particular kind of truth, which is eternal truth, absolute truth, philosophical truth. Whereas rhetoric, as the counterpart of dialectic, is a method, but it doesn't lead you to Sophia. Instead, it leads you to phronesis, which is practical truth or practical wisdom. And so they're equivalent, right? So Aristotle was someone who was a philosopher who appreciated rhetoric as opposed to Plato. Both are methods for arriving at a certain kind of truth. So phronesis is used to make decisions in communities, in the absence of perfect knowledge, in the absence of philosophical truth, right? Dialectic, the truth pre-exists the conversation, right? You sort of unwind all of your, misconceptions, and you get to the truth that pre-exists that conversation, that pre-exists the method of dialectic. Whereas with rhetoric, the truth is not known. It's something that's agreed upon.
It makes rhetoric a lot more prone to manipulation, right?
Yeah.
So I want to ask about, we have had other presidents. I'm thinking of Andrew Johnson, who flirted with real demagoguery. But we've had Andrew Johnson wasn't president for very long, and it was responded to with a lot of disgust. We've had no other president for whom this type of demagoguery was a real systemic feature of his presidency. I mean, it's actually the defining feature. Talk about that. How did we go from a society that was actually sort of unusually resistant to demagoguery, and the two-party system, for whatever faults it has, is pretty good at saying, okay, you get your Herman Cain fun, or your fun with what's her name from Minnesota, but then at the end of the day you get Mitt Romney, right? Or you get John McCain, or on the left you can flirt with your Bernie Sanders and we'll tolerate that. But at the end of the day, you're going to run a Hillary Clinton or a Barack Obama or a Joe Biden. Not to compare Bernie Sanders, who actually does represent some things, with Donald Trump. But I mean, the two-party system is historically really good at weeding out more extreme demagogic figures and kind of giving them their chance in the primary, and then saying, no, Huey Long, you actually, Huey Long's a bad example because they killed him, which is a little bit of a not extra two-party system situation. But how did we go from a society that weeds those people out from a society that actively rewards that behavior?
Yeah, if you look at the research in political science about how to prevent a demagogue, they'll tell you essentially three things. One is that the Constitution is designed to prevent them and reward men of reputation and weight of character. If that fails, then the party apparatus would weed out potential demagogues from seizing power. And if that failed, then the media would be, the sort of fourth estate and the final watchdog that would prevent a demagogue from seizing power. And that didn't work in 2016, and part of it is the context within which Donald Trump ran, right? So he ran during a historic crisis in trust, in distrust of institutions, of the branches of government, of established political leadership, of other kinds of established leadership. He ran during a crisis in polarization. The nation is, more distrustful now and more polarized now, but it was at that time historic levels of polarization, and a historic crisis in frustration. More Americans reported being frustrated with the direction of the nation than is usual, and really frustrated with the way that corruption and sort of things never change. And so Donald Trump didn't cause those conditions, but he took advantage of them. And he used rhetorical strategies that were designed to increase distrust, polarization, and frustration. Right? So he used threats of force ad baculum. He used ad hominem attacks. He used conspiracy theory. Those are all ways of increasing the distrust between himself and his followers and, established media or established political leaders, or the Democratic Party, the opposition. He, increased or tried to increase distrust in the process itself, right? In facts. He was very successful in getting his followers to believe that no one would tell them the truth but him, and that he was the one and only source of truth, which we know, right, that fact checkers have said that he is the least truthful president we've ever had. But that's not how his followers see him. They see him as heroically defending truth. So there's that in the context. And then I think there were some strategic errors that were made, particularly the mainstream media, where they thought, oh, Trump is just a flash in the pan. He's good for ratings. Let's stick the camera in front of him and follow him everywhere he goes and give him $5 billion in free airtime. He won't be the nominee. People won't vote for him. It's just a circus, but, people want to watch it. So let's let them. That was a mistake, right? So Trump used the media's platform to undermine the media's platform, tragically.
And, and when you, sorry, you're, it's causing an echo in and out, so I never know when to mute you. So when you in your book define demagogue, what makes Trump's rhetoric that of a demagogue, you focus on 6, I believe, features of his speech. Let's walk through those individually. You've mentioned a couple of them in passing here, but let's break it down. What are the features of Donald Trump's speech that make him sound different from all of the people who came before him?
Yeah. So in my book, I explain that Donald Trump used 3 strategies to bring himself closer to his followers and 3 strategies to move himself and his followers away from everyone else. And I tell a story about him using each of those strategies under each of the contexts of a distrusting electorate, a polarized electorate, and a frustrated electorate, which pretty much tells the whole story of the 2018 campaign or 2016 campaign. So the 3 that he uses to bring himself closer to his followers, the first and most important one is ad populum, and that is praising the wisdom of the crowd. But for Trump, it's not, all of the crowd, it's his people specifically. So he's constantly saying that they're the smartest, they're the best, they're the most patriotic, that he loves them, constantly affirming them as being the rightful good, best of America. And then himself as their leader, right? So there's a reciprocal relationship between them where, sometimes he's talking about how much he sacrifices for his good people, and so then therefore they owe him. But in all cases, it's about bonding him to his followers, because the demagogue is nothing without followers. The second thing that he uses is paralipses. And colloquially, this is, I'm not saying, I'm just saying. And Trump loves to not say, but just say, because it allows him to say 2 things at once. And so you can't hold him accountable for saying the terrible thing that he says he shouldn't say. And this is really helpful for him with his followers because it makes it appear as though he's a truth teller and he's just telling you the god-awful truth, right? The thing that no one else will tell you, that he knows he shouldn't tell you. And it makes you think like you really know the real Donald Trump, that it's not all an act, that he's very authentic. And it makes it seem as though you have like this backstage view of, Trump and what he's really supposedly thinking. And then the third strategy to connect him to his followers is American exceptionalism. And, presidents and presidential candidates use American exceptionalism. That's not unique to him, but the way that he uses it is, for him, it's America winning. So typically when presidential candidates or presidents use American exceptionalism, it's about America's obligation to the world. It's about living up to our values, motivating Americans, even as a Jeremiah, motivating Americans to the best version of themselves. But for Trump, it's just, zero-sum game, winning or losing. Either you're a winner and you're awesome, or you're a loser and you suck. And for Trump, he always portrays himself as the heroic, apotheosis of America winning, and that he will win for America, and that, it's very easy to do. Is that person going to ask a question? Hi.
No, Mike Chase is here because...
Give me a hard time.
Because I told Kate I was going to find out whether she'd committed a federal crime.
Mike Chase is the author of a book called A Crime a Day.
No, a Twitter feed called A Crime a Day. A book called How to Be a Federal Criminal. And Mike is here to give you, Kate, some very specific legal guidance about...
I have two ex-judges on my porch right now.
Yeah, but there is some relevant law about shellfishing in Cape Cod.
I know.
Wait, really?
I'm so disappointed. I'm on retainer. I'm free. Whenever you're thinking about doing anything, you just need to shoot me a text. But 36 CFR.
But I really think that this
you want to hear this, Kate.
Oh
you,
my God!
You want to hear this, Kate? Yeah, you may have not formed the relevant,
just
satisfied the scienter requirement, but you do want to hear the relevant code citation.
Yeah, hypothetically, 36 CFR 7.67 D. Right? Ooh. Did I get that right? Yes, I think I did. Makes it a federal crime. Well, in conjunction with 18 USC 1865. Makes it a federal crime to go shellfishing in the Cape Cod National Seashore without an appropriate... There. Okay, all right.
Fuck that. I didn't go in the seashore. I know where the seashore is. I know that. I know that that's illegal. I know that. You can't do anything in the seashore. It's federal land. And I know that. So Mike, well, sorry, Jen, we're going to take a brief detour because Mike, there was a guy relevant to me in a national park, possibly poaching seafood. There was a guy who went to Yellowstone and threw a bag full of raw chickens into a hot spring, and then got yelled at for cooking his chickens in a hot spring and fined a lot. So what happened? Were you I saw that coming a mile away?
Yeah, I did it. It was the crime of the day, and I will take that case because he was actually charged. I went on to Pacer. I spent some of my Pacer dollars, and I pulled up his documents. I'll gladly appear in that case. So he got charged with throwing or tossing objects into thermal features. But if he gently lowered the chicken down into the thermal feature, I think it's an acquittal. So I'm all in on that.
Yeah. And he was like, there was this great, I think I'm going to make it a hypothetical for one of my property law exams because he had this great line that was these laws are about land abuse. And I think this was land use.
I also just want to point out that Jonathan Rutenberg in the chat has it right. The unifying feature of these crimes is poaching. Here he is poaching a chicken in the hot spring. You're poaching oysters, but not in the national seashore. We've got our unifying theme. Meanwhile, back on the subject of presidential rhetoric, Jen was walking us through the non-criminal, but nonetheless offensive and terrible techniques that make up the president's rhetorical style. Thank you, Mike Chase.
Yeah, I was poaching.
Thanks, Mike. Bye, Mike.
He got eliminated.
Yep.
Hammer. So I have a question, Jen, that I actually have thought for a long time, which is that I grew up, I think I'm in a generation of people that really watched I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but watched The West Wing and developed an ear, like a romanticism and austerity around federal government, watching that show and being influenced by it and the rhetoric of the show. And it kind of like, in a certain way, John Favreau, like Obama's speechwriter, really kind of, who is in my same demographic and my same age, really dialed in, like really kind of had like that on lockdown. And so I guess I have a couple of questions. One, what is it about presidential rhetoric that makes it presidential and not demagogic? And you've defined kind of how Donald Trump does all these things, but like there are people that see those qualities in the speech writing or in the delivery or like the talking of like presidents, no matter what. Is there something in particular, like demagogue doesn't sound like a positive thing, let's put it that way. And like you have like said that demagogues are like, well, you could be a demagogue for good or a demagogue for bad. I take that as being kind of like a benign benign dictator versus like a terrible dictator type of thing. But what is it about demagoguery that versus presidential speech that is the defining difference in best case scenario?
Yeah, so that's a big question. So a president wouldn't do the three other things that Donald Trump does, except for under very specific circumstances, which is that they use it for war rhetoric. And so one thing that distinguishes Trump from a president is Trump's widespread use of weaponized communication strategies. So basically, he uses war rhetoric all the time and refuses to be held accountable for it. In terms of like what's presidential, Trump, says that presidential is boring and he could be presidential, but he doesn't want to be. And he prefers to be modern day presidential, which is very exciting, he says. And I try to explain that as him being the outrage president, right? So he takes advantage of the way that our public sphere in its current, iteration works on the metrics of attention and engagement. And he wields outrage like a cudgel, right? He has, he just is constantly outraging his base using tu quoque, which is an appeal to hypocrisy, always like whining, complaining about how rigged everything is, using conspiracy theory, all of that kind of stuff. And that really keeps his audience, attentive and engaged and allows him to control the public sphere. At the same time, all of the stuff that he does and says keeps his opposition really attentive and engaged. And so, using outrage as a strategy coupled with his weaponized communication strategies, the way that he speaks directly to his followers via social media, all of those are an innovation in modern day presidential communication. And to me, that's more demagoguery than it is presidential.
So you are now seeing, as we all are, the end of the Trump presidency, or at least the first term of the Trump presidency. And I'm curious whether, for your reflections on whether this suggests that this kind of demagoguery actually has a shelf life in elective American politics, and you can kind of get away with it for a long time as a rabble-rousing, House member of any of several sorts. But in the president, it ages badly, and maybe you can scrape together enough support this way to win. But unlike the ancient Roman demagogues who, would get into office and try to give out money, right? And that was the strategy, right? The Gracchi brothers or Marius, right? You get you become a hero of the people by promising land reform or promising distributions and then doing it. The president actually doesn't really have that power and so it's actually a lousy position from which to be a demagogue. If so, the rhetoric ends up wearing pretty badly. I'm curious whether the experience of Trump gives you discouragement, hope, or both about the future of demagoguery in the United States as a strategy and identity.
Yeah, I mean, so people ask me this a lot, right? Like, is Trump the future? I can make a compelling case in both directions, right? Like, I could convince you that he is, and also he is not the future for political discourse. I think no, and for the reasons that you indicated in your question. I think that the unaccountable leader doesn't work so well if you're actually the leader of the free world, right? And so all of his whining, his failure to ever have infrastructure week, right? His failure to come up with a plan for anything, blaming everyone around him, those are all strategies that were great if you're on the outside, right? And you're saying, oh, but I'm, this heroic guy, I am American greatness personified. I'm this great business guy. I have, good judgment, all those things. People are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt when they think you're the guy from The Apprentice. But once they see you for 4 years doing those same strategies to deny accountability, it doesn't work so well, especially during, a pandemic.
Yeah. So Jen, I'm super curious. Like, you have, one of the things that is kind of hitting me is you're talking is that I'm very curious as to how people adjust if they realize that they're talking to a demagogue versus if they realize that they're talking to a president. And I agree with everything you're saying, but I have two, this is kind of a two-part question. It's one, if you do realize that there is a demagoguery around the conversation, would you say are maybe the top 3 hallmarks of kind of sensing a demagogue versus a president? And does it have anything to do with kind of the way that he tweeted or the way that, the way that he spoke versus what he said?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the second question was just kind of is this, as you said, people ask you, is Trump the future? And I guess I would have to ask, are not demagogues always a threat? Is not the rhetoric of them always convincing? And as you reach back to Aristotle and Plato, and I was oh man, these are you could go through all of history with the incredible popularity of people that can do what Donald Trump did to an audience. So just say a little bit about both of those things, I guess.
Yeah. So to answer your first question, the 3 negative things that Trump did, maybe if I go through them, that'll help answer that question. So I told you the 3 things he did to bind himself to his followers. That's, to position himself as this heroic leader of the people. The 3 things that he did to separate himself and the people, his people, from everyone else, I think are really important to understand. So the first is ad baculum, and those are threats of force or intimidation. Right. So this is, putting pressure on people, sicking your followers on people, really trying to prevent
calling
them.
Your fellow Americans bad Americans in conversations with your staff.
Yeah.
We only call people good Americans here.
Yeah. I have heard
even the Canadians.
I have heard that he called me a bad American.
Oh no, you seem like a fine American to me.
I think I'm a really good American, but he said I was a bad American.
It's true.
At least he knows your name.
Yeah. But anyway, so
So ad
I
baculum.
mean, yeah, ad baculum. Ad baculum. Good reference, by the way. That's some like solid Latin. I feel like you're about to give me a degree, but
they're good terms to know. They're really good terms to know. So the second one is ad hominem. Right? So calling your opponent's names. So the thing about ad baculum, ad hominem, and ad populum.
Ad hominem strikes me as like more obvious than ad baculum. Like it is like less disguised. Like you can't get around the fact that you're just calling people names like for no reason.
Well,
right?
Unfortunately, the media like treated it like a game. They were like, "Ooh, Trump has a new nickname," right? And so instead of saying like Trump is delegitimizing legitimate political opposition, which is a way that democracies die, they said, "Ooh, Trump has a new nickname for Jeb, or Trump has a new nickname for Ted Cruz or Hillary Clinton or whatever." So they turned it into like, a thing that we should enjoy instead of what it was. But what I was trying to say is that all of the ad fallacies, the word ad means to, and so they're all distraction techniques. And so you take our attention away from what is the central issue and you reroute our attention to the people, to the threat, to the name calling. And so, when people talk about, Trump is so great at 4D chess or whatever, because he's always like distracting us. Those three strategies are three of the primary ways that he did it. So the third thing that he did to separate himself and his good people from everyone else was to use reification, which is treating people as objects. And so the combination of ad hominem, ad baculum, and reification is in fact, the recipe for war rhetoric. So when you look at genocides, when you look at how presidents have encouraged a nation to go to war historically and around the world, it's a combination of using those three, dehumanizing, name calling, threatening.
So
yes.
Not like I'm getting excited listening to you say that. So do you think that like there is a place for that type of rhetoric and it can like be used in a positive way? Not that war is positive, but like if there were bad guys to defeat, like Nazis killing millions of Jews, like that is like a positive way to like kind of like use the demagoguery rhetoric and like create that type of energy. But this is not one of those times, obviously.
Yeah, this is definitely not one of those times. Although if you're one of Trump's followers, that's how you see, right? Like this is all a war. It's us versus them. They've been winning for so long and they hate us. And, like we should take up arms against them. When presidents use those strategies, they aren't usually using them against their political opposition. First of all, they're usually using them like against other nations, and they're using it, not necessarily to distract us from the central issues of debate, right? So they're not using them in unaccountable ways, which is, again, that to me is the real thing about Trump, is that he's a master at preventing us from holding him accountable.
All right, let's go to audience questions. The first one who asked me to read it is from Penelope, who writes, Trump painted catching COVID as an act of courage, something he had to do because he is our leader. At the time, I noticed this as a desperate appeal to Christ-like self-sacrifice. In your book, you point out a similar tactic. Trump paints the border and Laredo, a safe American city, as dangerous, and said he had to take the risk to go. I see a direct connection between the two approaches. Why did the former work so well and the latter, thank God, fizzle?
That's such a great question, Penelope. Thank you for reading the book and for making that connection, because I hadn't actually thought of that myself. But you're right. So the story of Laredo is, he's a truth teller. And we know he's a truth teller because the one criterion for being a truth teller in the ancient Greek sense of it is that you risk yourself for telling this truth, that you're telling truth to power. And so going to Laredo, as well as giving him the chance to use his hat for the first time, it really was all about the danger that was on the border. And even though the reporters who were there were like, there's no danger here. What are you talking about? He kept saying over and over, oh, it's so scary here. It's just so frightening. We're just so terrified. Go back and read those. There were some really great articles that came out, and if we would have listened to people then. But anyway, I think that the same thing, you're right, happened with COVID. When he got it, it was, because he had risked himself, to communicate with his people, and he had to run this presidential campaign, and, he had to do the job of being president. And so, again, he's a truth teller when he's telling you that COVID is no big deal, that we have these great therapeutics. And it's also a part of, that fascist sacrifice, sin and redemption kind of cycle that says, look what I'm doing for you, and you owe me because I've done this. I sacrifice for you.
The Big Blue blogger has a very challenging question about the very premise that you're operating with.
Big Blue blogger, I have to walk away to take pies out of the oven, but I'm listening, and so I can hear it. Sorry.
Wow. I'm honored, Kate, that you're going to stay attentive while you're attending to such important business. I actually have a pizza that's starting to burn, so I'll make this quick. I think, Ms. Mercieca, I love your thesis. I think you're absolutely on target. I think we may be giving Trump a little too much credit for mastery of these techniques. I think a lot of it is just reptilian instinct and who he is, and a few parlor tricks that he learned from Roy Cohn. But do you think there's some usefulness in as a sort of inoculation technique to sort of educate the public and help us protect ourselves against these techniques? And can that work with the audience that he's appealing to, who may be beyond saving with that sort of education? I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, so can I just amplify that question a little bit? Because I don't actually understand your thesis to be that he has studied Greek rhetoric and he understands the techniques that he's using. I understand it rather as you are evaluating his speaking style and a very large quantity of his speeches against certain traditional techniques, and not asserting that he even has anything more than a reptilian understanding of what he's doing, just more that it maps onto things that the Greeks were quite attuned to. So I don't want to take away from Big Blue's secondary question here, but I guess my amendment to his question on the first point is how do we understand consciousness versus subliminality on his part in what he's doing?
Sure. So again, people ask me this all the time. So he hasn't released his transcripts, right? So we don't know if he studied rhetoric officially in college. Of course, there was a rumor that he had studied Hitler's speeches.
I'm going to put it solidly that he did not study rhetoric. I feel like there is rhetoric, no offense, I feel like is this post hoc study of an intuitive use of language that does that make sense? I don't think you study rhetoric and then decide to manipulate. Maybe you do if you're a complete psychopath, but I think that most people just are complete psychopaths and learn through trial and error that how rhetoric works. Does that make sense?
It does. And, I don't know is the thing. And I can't know because he won't let us see that information, of course. But, Trump is not a good businessman, but he is good at marketing. And a lot of what he did in 2016 and since was market himself. So people who study marketing, will recognize that he's actually quite good at that. He's good at selling stuff. So there's that. When he uses parallipses, he knows that he's doing it because he tells you as he does it. So he says, I shouldn't say this, but I'm not supposed to say this, but, so he actually previews that he knows that he's doing it. He's got some kind of awareness. I think he knows how to bully people. So he knows if you threaten people, if you call them names, right? That's going to have an effect. They're not complicated strategies, right? They're very obvious strategies to anyone who teaches argumentation, or public speaking. I first started studying him in like November of 2015. The New York Times was doing a thing where they wanted to analyze his rhetoric for a week and asked me if I could join the project and let them know if I saw, any instances of demagoguery and how he compared to previous demagogues in American history. And I saw him do these 6 things that week. And so he continued to do them and has continued to do them. And he uses them strategically. So sometimes he'll use an ad baculum threat like saying lock her up about Hillary Clinton. But if you read that chapter in my book, what's interesting about it is that he didn't come up with it, right? The crowd did, and they led him on it. And sometimes he rejected it completely. In fact, most of the time he was like, nah, let's just beat her in November. Nah, we don't need to do that. But in those moments when his campaign was the most threatened, he like pulled that out of his back pocket and he used it. And he used it to great effect. And then after he won, he said, nah, that's over. That plays well during the campaign, but we don't care about her. She's been through enough. She's a good person.
But it's not what he said to Jeff Sessions.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's always had a super ambiguous relationship with that. Like, I remember when he would say, nah, but he was like, it was a very different kind of nah than when a woman at one of John McCain's rallies said that Barack Obama was Muslim. And John McCain like stopped her dead. It was like,
no, I remember that. Everyone remembers that. I hope.
And Trump is like letting them chant, but he's kind of vamping off the chant, right? He's saying, nah, and then they say it some more, and he goes, nah.
It's even more interesting than that, because if you read that chapter, what you see is he lets the audience complete the syllogism to say, lock her up. So he'll give the major premise, he'll give the the minor premise, and then he'll lead them to chant, lock her up, and then he'll go, nah, right? And so it
just. Yeah, no, you're completely right. They let the base kind of prejudice like set the baseline, and then they kind of like, they can walk it back, or they can let it kind of settle for kind of like it is like, in my mind, it is one, oh no, Esther is like very weird static.
I think it.
You look like you're in like 1989 VHS, Esther.
It looks cool. It does not look much like Esther, but the floor is yours. I assume we can hear you.
And you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Actually, you have the color of my shirt somewhere in there, I think. Anyway, I'll read my question. Republicans seem to be able to weaponize progressive phrases like defund the police, abolish ICE, in a way that Democrats seem less competent at doing in return, say, to phrases like build the wall or lock her up. Do these types of phrases fall into different rhetorical categories? And what distinguishes them in terms of galvanizing either base support or base opposition? They seem like different types of phrases to me, but I'd just like to hear your expert opinion.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one too. I just talked to a reporter in the UK about this. The thing that we see a lot on conservative rhetorical strategies, I guess, is a very disingenuous read of their opposition. So, the rhetorical or argument fallacy is called a straw man or a straw person. And you take their claim or their position and you distort it in such a way that it's really easy to knock down. And you can do that by, eliminating, all of the complexity and, making it into just this one narrow thing, taking it completely out of context, pretending you don't understand it, and, assuming what it means. There's lots of different ways that you can deploy, the straw man. And that seems to be a strategy that is well used on conservative sides and not so much on liberal sides. I think liberals like the complexity more, and they're less likely to use that kind of argument strategy, which, is effective, but is technically a fallacy. Maybe they were all high school and college debaters. I don't know. But yeah, and then there's also, the sloganeering part of it. And so, if you read Lakoff and people like that who talk about framing, conservatives have been better at deploying frames in their policies and matching those frames to their agenda than
What do you mean by frames?
So I'm not a linguist, but I've read some of this work and it's really good. And interesting to me. And so the idea is that the way that you explain something, and he talks about, whether it's a motherly frame or a fatherly frame and different kinds of things like that, that it actually like reroutes the circuits in people's brains, and that some frames are sticky and others aren't. And so that they're more likely to resonate with people, that it actually, provides like the mechanism by which you think, that whole, you can't think of an elephant thing. And so I think that would be my answer to the question, but, there's other things you can say about like discourse communities and enthymemes and how you argue strategy. I don't have an answer for that, like a real answer to solve that problem. But I
like it when people don't have real answers, by the way, because I don't always think that there are real answers, and specifically around rhetoric. Like, I think that this is but like, thank you for admitting that. Like, I think that it's nice. Sorry, Tony Cava, the floor is yours.
Hi. This is
I
one
see
of
what
those
you did
days
there,
when
Kate.
Hello. I enjoy your sparkling wine.
What's that?
I said hello. I enjoy your sparkling wine.
Oh, yes.
She was making a joke about Cava.
I was told to be fun.
No.
It is fun really here. Fun. We're barely fun. Barely fun. No sparkling wine.
Well, this is one of those shows that I wish I could just quit my day job and be in the chat and be fully present and in the show, because this is a great show. This builds on Esther's question, I think, and maybe it's the same question. You could just kind of push me along my way, if so, but it's kind of more seeing it from like from the progressives or the Democrat side. And I'm wondering if there are messaging strategies Dems and progressives can employ that could preempt or defang Republican, framing of issues such as police reform, the way they kind of commandeered the term defund the police, or social progressivism being framed as socialism, or even truth itself being reframed as fake news. So I'm wondering if there are ways that Dems or anyone else can take their language back.
Yeah, I think so. It might require being more coherent, like as a message strategy, like moving forward. It seems to me, and, it's not entirely perfectly the case, because there's actually stories in my book where there's debate over how to talk about things, and you see Trump being led by, Rush Limbaugh or by InfoWars, or like, some pretty far out extremists, the National Enquirer, and like changing his strategies. But primarily, it seems to me that the right is more coherent about like deploying a consonant message that is unified, and using like similar talking points so that their propaganda is, is like univocal, like it's one voice. Whereas it seems to me like you don't have that on the left. And part of that
So-
might be mainstream versus progressives. Part of that might be, primarily the left speaks through mainstream media, that there isn't like a unified, like there is on the right, a unified left-wing media.
Yeah, I mean, like, so this kind of goes into the idea that this is in part like some of the rhetoric and how the rhetoric plays itself out is in part like a mechanism of the function and the form of how the rhetoric has to play out, which is that there are all of these various kind of strands of the left and the big tentness of the left. And so like in comparison, the right feels like, even if it's not actually, and there's lots of different strands of being on the right, like the right feels like it's this cabined, small kind of thing, which is kind of a little bit my point, like, which is like, is rhetoric really a study about what is or what is perceived? Which is kind of like, is it a study of like, sorry, not to make it super meta, but like, I feel like it is both, obviously, but in particular with this demagogue, it has been both. Like he has made the, like he has, as you said, like he had the nah, but he did, like the nah didn't really do anything. Like that, like his base took up a certain amount of rhetoric and ran with it. And then it became his rhetoric, whether he liked it or not. And there is an organic element to rhetoric, to language, to everything that you can't run away from, because like it's just not a top-down thing. Like you can't get people to memorize definitions. Like you have to, like it is through use. So part of this like really strikes me as like, okay, well, is this just like a use case scenario? Like through all of these types of things, and if we just stop people from using it, like would there be a way to cut it off? I don't know. What do you think? Would there have been like a point that we could have like stopped Donald Trump with his like on rhetoric alone, or the media could have? I think you have to unmute her, Ben.
Sorry?
There you go.
That's all like so smart. Yes. Those are good questions. So, for me in this book, it's a history, right? Like it's a history of a very short time ago, but I wrote it as like, this is what happened. And really a lot of it, I was only able to see in retrospect, in the moment, I don't even remember it that way, as it happened. It's only when I'm able to piece it together that I can like actually see what the story was. But in terms of like the study and practice of rhetoric, you're so right. Like there's no way, like you can be prescriptive and you can say, this is what we should do. These are norms that we should follow to, use rhetoric in a way that's going to promote good decision-making, that's going to lead to democratic stability and trust in the political process and the political system, which is what I try to do, right? Like, and say like, and these aren't those things. And so there were moments, I mentioned like the media just stuck the camera in front of Trump and let him say whatever he wanted. And so that was a mistake. But on the same hand, on the same side, I guess, the other side, Trump broke like the frame for how the news was supposed to work, right? So, it's a kind of spectacle, and it exists based on certain rules. The reporters get to sit down with a person who's running for office and ask them questions. And, the person responds in some way, maybe dissimulating, maybe, changing topics slightly. But, Trump would just attack them. He would just say, you're a liar. Why do you ask me that awful question? Why didn't you mention the polls from, these three places, which were much better for me? This is why they call you fake news. This is why they hate you. This is why no one has any trust with you, right? So he just totally, like, it was asymmetrical the way he broke. And so for a long time, the media didn't know what to do, because they want to cover the guy because it's newsworthy and people want to see that. But at the same time, what do you say when they break the frame, right? They like and attack you? His supporters love that.
I do wonder, like, and I do think that, like, we're two, I would say, two solid standards of deviation off of of our last terrible demagogue being Hitler and like others, but like really kind of like as in a global scale, and like having Boris Johnson, having Bolsonaro, having Donald Trump, all of these kind of demagogues at the same time, the populism that's taken place. I don't know. I would like to think that modern journalism will get it better the next time around, and be a little bit like, I think that there's been a norm adjustment. I think that they've had to understand that this is not just any old public figure or political figure like doing this shit. This is like actually they're amplifying messages and they're doing these things and they're smarter and savvier about it. But they're not used to that. They weren't for the last 60 years. So anyway, Ben?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Hitler is an extremely peculiar demagogue, in that he had a genuinely coherent governing philosophy to which he was committed to a bizarre degree. I think we use him as a model of a lot of things that he's actually a bad model of because he was so extreme. What is the actual model that Donald Trump is playing to? It's not even Mussolini, right? It's not even there's no like theory of governance under any of this. He's kind of a like Silvio Berlusconi figure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that Silvio Berlusconi, like, and I'd be interested in your take, Jen, like, this is to my point that it's all organic, that it's like, if they get positive reinforcement about their stupid things that they say, they just kind of like start repeating them and then they become more extreme and kind of more demagogic and they don't have any filter. And if they're like a kind of a type of personality, it all just goes downhill from there. But go ahead.
Yeah, so at the end of my book, I try to explain that Trump is America's authoritarian P.T. Barnum, right? That he's part authoritarian
good.
And part.
That's really good.
Right? So he's got us all on tilt, right? We're paying attention to his every move. Is he an authoritarian? Isn't he? Nobody knows, right? Like, how has the last month played out? It's all about, like, is Trump really doing a coup or not? Did he coup today? We can't tell, right? And part of that is his strategy. I also compare him a little bit to Hitler at the end. Hitler was a propagandist in World War I. He worked as the propagandist, for the German army. And he learned a lot of those strategies from doing that work. And so when you read Mein Kampf, you can distill out of it a propaganda recipe. And it's not that different from Trump's. It's, repetition is very important. Simplification, right? He hated, elite intellectual discourse. So, privileging the spoken word over the written word, using rallies to motivate people, using insignia, using violence when needed, threats of force and intimidation. The recipe isn't that different. There's a kind of, Kenneth Burke is a rhetorical theorist who wrote an essay about Mein Kampf in 1938, and he called Hitler's, demagogic effectiveness, which is what I mean when I say that Trump has a kind of rhetorical genius. They're not that different in terms of how they deploy their rhetoric, to gain attention and to gain followers for their message.
All right. Mary Garrison, who is cleverly disguised as a maroon rectangle. You get the last question today.
Okay, I've been enjoying this so much. Thank you, Ben and Kate, and thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to be ordering your book right after this and also assigning it.
I've already ordered it. I'm excited.
Yeah, so a question for you now. Occasionally, Trump uses language that sort of gives us a glimpse that this profoundly ignorant mind has had input from another world of discourse or texts. And we've mentioned, that he owned Hitler's speeches. The thing that struck me most recently was him knowing the phrase "stand back and stand by." I'm sure he's never trained with the militia. And I was wondering if you'd thought systematically about whether any of those phrases can be sort of traced back to their quarries.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. So in my book, I do some of that where I explain, so propaganda analysts call it narrative laundering, how, talking points and memes like move from disreputable places to be mainstreamed. And so I trace out some of that and how Trump, like, for example, when he called Muslim refugees Trojan horse. That wasn't something he came up with, and so I can trace out like exactly how he got that idea when he started saying it and why. And it was because of a lot of pressure from the right. But I haven't thought about that, in terms of all of his speeches or terms. But one thing that has really interested me in the last few months is when the tapes from Bob Woodward came out, and we heard him talk about the virus in like February of this year, and he had accurate information that he could convey, intelligently and clearly. Which was very different from the information that he gave to the public. That to me was a really interesting thing because it confirmed what a conservative politician had told me, which was that Donald Trump in private is very different from Donald Trump in public. That, when you're in the Oval Office or you're in a meeting with the guy, that he actually isn't dumb, that he has good information, that he asks good questions, and that, he does this public persona. And so that was kind of evidence to support that, which, I don't know, 2 anecdotal pieces of evidence, but.
Jim Comey has said the same thing. I mean,
I've heard the same from my White House sources.
So I don't know because I've never been in the room with the guy. I've read transcripts of interviews where, he's trying to impress the reporters that he's talking to, and he does sound more knowledgeable. So P.T. Barnum.
P.T. Barnum is P.T. Barnum is much better than Hitler. I'd settle for 8 P.T. Barnums over
Well, P.T. Barnum never sought political power.
No, he was an elected official.
Was he?
But he stopped being P.T. Barnum once he was elected.
Okay.
But
all right. We've got to
ahead,
wrap up.
Oh wow, it's 6:08. Jesus,
it is.
I didn't even realize the time.
Sorry.
Wow,
on the theory that in lieu of fun never
fun.
takes a break, we will be back tomorrow, Thanksgiving Day at 5:00, but it'll be just us because we're not having a guest on Thanksgiving. Except you guys, you should show up if you're sated with food. And if there's like 3 of you, then we can just bring everybody on the screen and have a chat.
That'd be fun.
Jen, what a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
This is so great. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you. I have,
show us a copy of the book.
I have hats.
Oh, excellent.
Oh my God.
I could send you a hat.
Please. I wear hats like that. I would wear that hat clamming illegally in the National Seashore.
You can only use it for legal clamming.
I will only use it for legal clamming.
Special thanks today to Mike Chase for showing up on retainer to determine whether a fact pattern does or does not meet the definition of a federal crime.
Love that guy.
Code citation at his disposal for illegal shellfish harvesting on Cape Cod. We will be back 22 hours and 51 minutes from now. And until then, Kate.
We don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we don't have a demagogue for president.
After 56 days from now.
Yes. You're the one who started this off by saying Donald Trump is no longer a president, but he's still in office or something like that.
Something like that.
I know. We're all there.
We will see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Thank you, Jen.
Bye, then. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.